It's no secret that some of the best guitars and basses ever made are vintage instruments now, and with a shrinking supply and increasing demand, it's no surprise that some of these are starting to get really unattainable. But despite the market getting pretty crazy right now for certain vintage pieces, there's actually a lot of stuff out there that I think is still really worth buying as a player for its current market value. So today I want to talk about 5 instruments that you can get right now that I think are really worth their current market value and would be a good investment, both as a player and collector. So the idea for this video stemmed from a conversation that I was having with Thomas. We've been fortunate enough to play a ton of really high-end vintage guitars between our friends that collect, between the inventory that comes in the shop, between going into high-end guitar shops all over the world. We've seen a lot of cool stuff and we are very grateful for that. And sometimes we will play a guitar or a bass that demands a really high price and we'll say, wow, this is really special. And while maybe it doesn't fit our own budgets, we can see that there's value there and that it might be worth the investment to somebody who can afford it. We've also played a lot of stuff that we've gone, wow, that definitely doesn't justify the price tag. So today I want to talk about the ones that we felt did justify the price tag, that are still fairly affordable. I'm looking for stuff that's mostly under like $6,000 and especially under $10,000, because to me, once it hits that 5-figure price point, it just becomes a little unattainable for most of us. This is not a comprehensive list of the only 5 things that are worth buying. There is way more than we have time to talk about in one video. This isn't even a top 5 in a certain order. This is just 5 guitars that have come to mind recently that I wanted to point out. They're not in any specific order, like I said, but number 1 is probably my favorite pick for right now. Let's get into it. Vintage Les Paul Juniors have gone from being fairly attainable to somewhat unattainable now, with most decent examples, whether it's the single cut or double cut, going for over $10,000. But a guitar that's very close to that is the SG Junior, and those are still commanding a nice bit of money, but not as much as the Les Paul Juniors. Comparative to Les Paul Juniors, you can still get SG Juniors for probably, I would say, about half the price. Pretty much anything is going to be under $10,000 unless it's something really special like a TV yellow SG Junior, which is incredibly rare. But if you're just looking for like a cherry Junior, or especially one that's been refinished or had a repair, they're really attainable right now. You can get more players grade examples from the late 60s for like $2,000-ish, $3,000, depending what it is. And then you can get really clean examples for around $5,000. Obviously, the later you go in the 60s, the prices start to come down quite a bit. So there's a lot of really good guitars in that range that play really well and sound fantastic. I love SG Juniors. I think they're kind of underappreciated. And if you find a really good one, I think they're worth picking up now. I think they're something that is going to appreciate quite a bit in the coming years, as I don't think they've gotten too crazy yet. Just compared to where other stuff is, I think they're still pretty reasonable. So that is my number 5 pick. So number 4 is not from Fender or Gibson or Martin or any of those. It is vintage Music Man guitars and basses. Specifically the old Stingray basses and old Sabre guitars from the 70s. Those are really cool instruments. They are proper vintage at this point, and they play really great when you find a good example. They sound fantastic. Sometimes they have kind of interesting pickup combinations, but I really like these old instruments, and I think because they're not from one of the big brands, they don't really carry a crazy price tag. You can get a vintage Stingray bass for a similar price to a newer used Stingray bass from like 2010, around there. So that's a really cool anomaly, and that's kind of one of the things I want to focus on in this video, is the stuff that you can find for similar prices to a newer example, but you're getting something vintage. And this is likely to appreciate a little bit quicker than that newer guitar. If you haven't seen it before, I would definitely check out the 70s Music Man Sabres. Very cool guitars. Most of us already know the Stingray basses, so you guys know about those, but lots of cool gems from them, and most of them are still pretty attainable, with prices starting at literally like $1,000 and going up to $2,000 or $3,000. Very reasonable prices for what they are, and I highly recommend checking them out if you haven't before. My number 3 pick is vintage Fender short scale basses, specifically Fender Mustang basses and Fender Music Master basses. I absolutely adore these instruments, and they haven't gotten too crazy in price yet. You can get a really cool Mustang bass from the 70s for like $2,000 to $4,000. Sometimes they'll get a little crazier if it's a really cool and rare finish, but still pretty attainable. And these are really well-made instruments with great fretboards on them, great necks. I love these. Music Master basses are even more attainable than Mustang basses, with examples from the 70s going even from like $1,000 for a player grade one up to maybe $2,000 for a cleaner one. Once again, the earlier you go in the 70s, the price does come up a little bit. Something that's a big plus with these Music Master and Mustang basses is that they have a really high rate of playing really well. As I kind of alluded to earlier in this video, There's a lot of expensive vintage instruments that just don't play that well. Not because that model is anything bad, but just most of the examples you come across aren't as great as the really good ones. The Mustang basses and Music Master basses are pretty consistent across the board. Obviously, I've played a few that really shine above the rest, but I don't know that I've ever played like a bad Mustang bass from the 70s. They're all really cool. I personally have a 1971 Music Master bass that has been refinished, which I probably will get refinished again since it's just in black right now, which is kind of boring, but the neck on this thing is really, really cool, and it's a fun bass. If you can find a cool colored Mustang bass from the 70s, I think those are the ones that are going to appreciate a lot in the coming years, so keep your eyes peeled. So number 2 is something that's going to come as absolutely no surprise to you guys who watch the channel, and that is early era Fender Japan. As of now, and it'll probably stay this way, the most desirable guitars from Fender Japan are the JV instruments from 1982 to 1984. These are actually the instruments that Fender's kind of been reissuing now for the export market, which I guess for us is the domestic market, but the export market Strats and Tellys. And those are all based on those first 2 years of production from Fender Japan. By now, the JV series of instruments, that initial run from 1982 to 1984, have definitely gotten up there in price, getting to be between $2,000 and $4,000 when most Fender reissue instruments from Japan kind of sit more in the $1,000 to $3,000 bracket. The JV stuff starts a lot higher, and I've even seen ones go north of $5,000, which is kind of a lot considering what people are used to paying for Japan-made Fender. I think that these early examples are going to continue to rise in value as they're very historically significant. This is the first time that Fender was making instruments outside of the US, and as a lot of us know, Fender US was kind of blown away by this first run of Fender Japan stuff, and they even admit that this stuff was a little bit better than what was being made in the States at the time. So I think as time goes on, those first few years of Fender Japan will continue to get more and more collectible. But even beyond the JV years, just maybe the first 20 years of Fender Japan production, I think is something that's going to really appreciate over time. People love to debate the MIJ versus CIJ, or made in Japan versus crafted in Japan. Comment below if you want us to do a video on the difference between crafted in Japan and made in Japan, and then when it became made in Japan again in 2007, and then it's still made in Japan, but it's different now. It's a lot of nuance, so if you want us to talk about that, let us know down below, and I will spend a year writing a video on that, and I'll bring it to you guys. By today's standards, the initial run of made in Japan are still a little bit more desirable than the crafted in Japan. The crafted in Japan guitars are still really, really great, and I think anything from the 80s stuff, the 90s stuff, to the 2000s, it's all really, really good, but kind of everything that's pre-CIJ, I think is going to become more and more collectible as time goes on, and I totally get it. These are really, really good instruments, and you can still get a lot of them for like $1,500-ish in the current market. Obviously, it wavers a little bit and depends what model you're getting and where you're getting it from, and so on and so forth, but I think these guitars are obviously a really good investment at this point. We wouldn't carry them in the quantities that we do if it wasn't something that we believed in, so a big back these instruments. Obviously, I back Fender Japan across the board, but I would keep an eye out for anything from the 80s, as I think those guitars in particular are going to start appreciating the quickest. So as I said at the beginning of this video, this isn't in any specific order, which is why I don't have any honorable mentions. Just wanted to kind of talk about 5 sets of instruments that I really like that are still pretty attainable. Number 1 is going to be my favorite pick, and that is vintage Gibson J-45, specifically from the mid-60s, as those are the ones that are really, really good and still attainable. Pretty much any Gibson J-45, especially from 1967 or before, is probably gonna be pretty incredible. These are my favorite acoustic guitars in the world, and the older you get, the more crazy the prices get, but there's this really nice sweet spot between 1965 and 1967 where the prices aren't too crazy. You can get a good example from between $3,500 and $6,000. And these are just amazing Gibson acoustics, and I think really show what Gibson acoustic does well. We have this example from 1967, which sounds absolutely phenomenal, and the finish on this just looks so cool. There's really no modern acoustics that rightfully recreate the woods used here, as well as just the finish, and just every little nuanced detail about these feels right. It feels at home, and just the way that these play, the way they respond, is just everything that I personally look for in an acoustic. I personally own one of these from 1967 in a nice cherry sunburst. This one is the regular sunburst. If you know me, you know I absolutely love these guitars. And at the current price point, I would definitely recommend getting out there and trying to find one of these if you like what you hear with this one. I don't think that these are going to be coming down in value. and I think they're only going to get more expensive and harder to find. So if you're into one of these, I would definitely try to find one sooner than later, as who knows what the prices are going to do in the future on these. So if you're watching this video around the time it comes out, then this will be kind of the beginning of the spring guitar show circuit. If you're watching this the day it comes out, I think we'll actually be in Asheville at the Carolina Guitar Show, which is March 9th and 10th. Later this month, we will be in Nashville on the 23rd and 24th. And then not too far after that, we will be in Dallas, Sarasota, and lots more cities across the country and the world for the rest of the year. So I think this is a good time to put this out. If you're going to any of these shows, and you see any of these guitars, don't be afraid to pick them up and see if you like them, and maybe you will enjoy them as much as I do. So as I said, this is only 5 instruments out of a whole world of cool vintage stuff, so please let me know down below in the comments what vintage guitars that are still fairly attainable that you guys like, that you would recommend we check out, as there is a pretty much endless amount of options out there. If you bought a vintage instrument in the past for less than the current market value, we also love hearing those stories too. We always hear of people getting, 60s and 70s Fender and Gibson for way less than they're going for now. So if that's you, let us know. It's definitely crazy to see how things have changed over the years. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and all that other good stuff. We do really appreciate it. And we will see you in another video soon. Bye.